Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for stopping by. If you're new to my channel, what we like to do here, amongst other things, is dissect and analyze high-profile cases. Specifically, what I like to do is present a case to you in my capacity as an attorney. So I only focus on the material facts and any evidence that is available before I break down the offense that the accused has been charged with into its elements in order to demonstrate to you what must be satisfied in order to secure a conviction. So essentially, I treat you, the audience, as the jury. So the case is presented to you, and then in the comment section, you render your verdict. Today's video is going to be on quite a controversial case. It's actually a bit of an older one. So it started in the 80s and ended in the early 90s. Before my time, I didn't even exist at the time. So if you were around maybe a teenager in the 80s and onwards, you may be familiar with this case already. I only became aware of it a couple of weeks ago, entirely by accident, when I came across a series on Netflix about the case called Dirty John, Betty Broderick, and the latter is the name of the accused in this case. If you want more of an in-depth insight into the facts of this case, I do recommend watching the series. Of course, there is going to be a little bit of fiction and drama incorporated into it to make it more enjoyable to watch, but for the most part, based on the research I conducted, it is quite accurate. However, it's more from Betty's perspective than anyone else. So Betty Broderick, the accused, is the protagonist of that series, meaning it is biased. So do bear that in mind. So what makes this case controversial is the polarizing response that it received when it was happening back in the 80s, and to some extent even until today. If you look at the comments under YouTube videos that talk about this topic, you will see how a lot of people still support what Betty did. And what makes that controversial is that Betty killed two people. Her ex-husband, Dan Broderick, and his new bride, Linda Broderick, born Linda Kolkena or Kolkina. They pronounce it as Kolkena in the series, so that's the pronunciation that I'm going to go with. Now, what makes this case a little bit tricky is it's, as I said with the series, it's predominantly from Betty's point of view, and that is because the victims are deceased. Now, there is testimony from friends and family to relay, I suppose, the other side of the story, but it will never be as accurate as it would have been if Dan and Linda were still alive. So do bear that in mind as we go through this case. For this reason, I'm going to start off with the undisputed facts, and then I'm going to move on to what I call Betty's version and the prosecution's version. Betty and Dan married on the 12th of April, 1969, and they were married for 16 years until things started to break down in 1983. They had 4 children and they had a little bit of a rocky start. So Dan was a medical student at Cornell and he ended up graduating with an MD. And throughout his studies, Betty, who was already bearing him his children, so they started having children very early on in their marriage, was the main breadwinner of the family at that time because Dan was busy studying full time. After he graduated from medical school, he then went on to study law at Harvard because he realized that being a doctor was not for him. And so again, Betty was left to fend for the family as Dan was preoccupied with full-time studies. Upon graduating from Harvard, the family moved to San Diego, where Dan practically found immediate success as an attorney. This success reflected on the family, so eventually they became quite a wealthy and very well-off family in San Diego, and Betty became a well-known and popular socialite in the San Diego scene. Everything seemed to be picture perfect, at least to outsiders, until 1983 when Dan, who was turning 39 that year, hired 22-year-old Linda Kolkena as his legal assistant at his own firm. Betty suspected that Dan and Linda had started an affair, but Dan consistently denied this until they separated in 1985 and he came clean about the affair. After their separation, Dan paid Betty a monthly income in spousal support. It's important to note that this was a voluntary decision on Dan's part. There was no court order forcing him to do so. After the separation, at some point, Betty voluntarily left her 4 children at Dan's house. And I'm mentioning this because this was an important factor in Betty's behavior, according to her. The couple's divorce was finalized on the 16th of July, 1986. Throughout this time, Betty was acting up and leaving threatening voicemails. She even drove her car into Dan's front door. And this is an undisputed fact, an act which ended up getting her held involuntarily for 72 hours in a psychiatric ward. Fast forward to early 1989 when Betty purchases a .38 caliber revolver. On the 22nd of April 1989, Dan and Linda were married. And then in the early hours of the morning of the 5th of November 1989, Betty went to the couple's home and shot them while they were still in bed. She then ripped the telephone in the bedroom off the wall and threw it in the hallway outside, presumably where the couple couldn't reach it. Betty's main defense and her main story is that she was a battered wife. So the battered person syndrome or battered woman syndrome was very heavily relied upon in her defense. Battered person or battered woman syndrome is not a legal defense per se, so it's not actually codified or mentioned in any statute in California, and that is the relevant jurisdiction that we're dealing with here because all of this took place in San Diego. But it is a popular legal argument that is used by a lot of spouses that claim that they were driven to commit the crime that they are charged with, for example, murder in this case, because of the years of abuse that they have suffered at the hands of their abusive spouse. Despite not formally being a codified legal defense, it is used and relied upon significantly by spouses around the world, and it's also supported by mental health professionals, at least until recently. There has been a little bit of controversy recently in this area. So it can be used to supplement the following recognized codified defenses: self-defense, provocation, insanity, and diminished responsibility. So relying on this defense, Betty claims that Dan used and discarded her, only to trade her in for a much younger version of herself. And as if that wasn't enough, he took her children away from her forcefully and permanently kept them away from her by seeking and securing sole custody after the divorce proceedings were concluded. She claims that Dan was verbally and mentally abusive towards her, so he constantly put her down, called her old, fat, ugly, and boring. And then when Linda came into the picture, when the relationship became official, Betty claims that Linda had also started to participate in this behavior. She claims that Dan drove her insane by gaslighting her. So when she accused him of having an affair for 2 years in the period between 83 and 85, he called her crazy and said that she was imagining everything. She further claims that she was unable to gain adequate legal representation in the divorce proceedings. She actually ended up representing herself because Dan was such an influential attorney in the area, and at one point he was even the president of the San Diego Bar Association. And so according to Betty, he used that position and influence and power to bar her from getting adequate representation. Betty also claims that Dan fined her, so he deducted money from the monthly income that he paid her for every transgression that she committed. So if she insulted him or left him threatening voicemails, he would dock $100. If she showed up at his property unannounced, it was another $250. If she entered, it was an even higher amount. And if she took the children without his permission, it was $1,000 cut off. She claimed that Dan and Linda sent her ads for weight loss programs and anti-wrinkle treatments in an effort to mentally torment her. And then, according to her, after 6 years of putting up with this, she went to their house on the 5th of November in an attempt to talk some sense into them. So she used the gun, according to her, to threaten them and force them to listen to her. And then, if the negotiation didn't go her way, Betty said that her intention was always to shoot herself in their presence. What changed that course of events is apparently Linda's cry for Dan to call the police. So they were in bed and she yelled out, "Call the police." And that's when Betty screamed and tensed and just basically sprayed bullets in an unintended area, which ended up shooting both Dan and Linda. And so she essentially claims that she sprayed bullets indiscriminately. So she wasn't aiming at anyone, but the bullets accidentally, according to her, ended up making contact with Linda, one in the back of the head and one in the chest, and Dan in his chest. Linda died instantly, and Dan actually allegedly spoke to Betty and said, "There, you got me. I'm dead," before dying minutes later, but not in Betty's presence. So according to her, she left him alive, which is why she pulled the phone out of the wall and threw it in the hallway to prevent him from calling the police. Now, the prosecution's version is essentially the opposite of Betty's version. They argue that Betty voluntarily dumped her children at Dan's home to give him a taste of what it's like to be a parent, because he was always absent from the family home and never really participated in the upbringing and raising of the children. Witnesses for the prosecution, including the children, testify that Betty constantly left threatening and insulting voicemail messages for Dan and Linda at their home. Betty broke into Dan's house multiple times and vandalized it in various ways. They claimed that even the hate mail that she allegedly received from Dan and Linda was actually sent to herself by herself in an effort to make people believe that her allegations against Dan and Linda were true. In a nutshell, the prosecution was arguing that in Betty's mind, if she couldn't have Dan, then no one else could. And when Dan remarried and it became clear that he was very serious about Linda, Betty couldn't handle it and took both their lives. Now, Betty was charged with the murder of both Dan and Linda, and the prosecution was aiming for first-degree murder. The defense was arguing manslaughter. Now, I will be explaining both of these terms to you in detail in order for you to understand them thoroughly before arriving at your own verdict. The first trial actually ended up in a hung jury, so the jury were deadlocked. They were unable to arrive at a unanimous decision. This is a testament to how much support Betty was actually receiving at that time. It was actually a very popular case. It was all over the news, which is why I'm presuming that some of you out there who were there at that time, who were old enough to remember, may already be aware of this case. It was a high-profile case, which benefited Betty greatly in the first trial because, as I said, it was a very polarizing case. People didn't know whether to feel sorry for Betty and believe her story of being a battered wife, a tormented person who was driven to kill, or whether to believe the prosecution's portrayal of Betty as a psychopath, a woman with no limits, no empathy, and who would stop at nothing to get her way. So before we start analyzing the offenses themselves, it's important to note that the burden of proof falls on to the prosecution. So it is entirely up to the prosecution to prove Betty's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Betty does not have to prove her innocence. I think the best way to understand this standard of proof is to just take it at face value, beyond a reasonable doubt. So you should have no reasonable doubt in your mind that the accused is guilty. Now, it's important to note that this does not mean the absence of doubt. You don't have to be 100% certain. I think percentage-wise, I've heard a few people use the 80 to 90% range. But the key word here is reasonable. The best way to understand what reasonable is to give you an example of what unreasonable doubt is. Let's say the strategy for Betty's defense was that aliens did it. Assigning blame to aliens does not plant a reasonable doubt in the minds of a reasonable person. But if there was, let's say, CCTV footage of the accused, of Betty, at a gas station or at a supermarket, at the same time that the murders were thought to have occurred, that has the potential to make a reasonable member of the public doubt that Betty actually committed the crime. Now, it doesn't have to be a solid alibi. All it needs to do is plant a reasonable doubt in the mind of a juror. So you don't have to be 100% convinced, although in some cases it's very clear cut and you can be 100% convinced. But that's not the threshold that has to be met by the prosecution. All right, so the laws of California govern this case, which means we have to refer to the California Penal Code in order to ascertain whether Betty did in fact commit the offenses that she has been charged with. Murder is defined in Section 187 as the unlawful killing of a human being or fetus with malice. So with malintent, you intended to take someone's life. First-degree murder is defined in Section 189, and it lists a number of acts that amount to first-degree murder. But the one that applies to this case is a willful, deliberate, and premeditated killing. The key word here being premeditation, as that is what essentially distinguishes first-degree murder from second-degree murder in a lot of jurisdictions, not just California. Subsection B states that all other kinds of murders are of the second degree. So anything falling short of a premeditated killing in this case would amount to second-degree murder. So in order for the prosecution to successfully convict Betty with first-degree murder, which is what they were aiming for, they must successfully demonstrate to the jury that premeditation, intention, and action, so the act of killing someone, have all been satisfied. Premeditation means prior planning, so it wasn't a spontaneous act. It's important to note that premeditation need not have occurred for an extensive period of time. That element can be satisfied within minutes before the murder. The defense were relying on manslaughter. Section 192 defines manslaughter as the unlawful killing of a human being without malice. So it's lacking that malintent, that willfulness to end someone's life. It's further divided into three subcategories. Voluntary manslaughter, which is manslaughter that takes place suddenly in the heat of passion. Involuntary manslaughter, which is a death that is a result of an unlawful act, not amounting to a felony, or a death resulting from a lawful act, which was carried out in an unlawful manner or without due caution. The best way to describe involuntary manslaughter is an accidental death. And the third is vehicular, which is beyond the scope of this case and will not be discussed any further. So the defense was arguing both voluntary and involuntary manslaughter. So the jury were free to arrive at either one of those convictions. After extensive deliberations, the jury arrived at a verdict of second-degree murder on both counts, so for both Dan and Linda. Now, this wasn't because the prosecution failed to prove premeditation beyond a reasonable doubt. It's actually because most of the jury were leaning towards first-degree murder, but then a couple were intent on manslaughter, and so to ensure that a hung jury doesn't occur again, so to avoid a deadlock, the compromise amongst the jurors was to arrive at a verdict of second-degree murder. So it was kind of like the middle ground. That's how they saw it. And so Betty was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life. So consecutive means they're served one after the other as opposed to side by side. So 30 years plus 2 years for illegal use of a firearm. So 32 years to life. She's actually been denied parole, I think, a couple of times since 1990, which is when she was found guilty. And that's because the parole board cited a lack of remorse on her part. So she still isn't remorseful for what she did. If you'd like to supplement your knowledge of this case, again, I do recommend watching the series before you arrive at a verdict here, because I know that I gave you a very brief overview of the facts, just focusing on the material aspects of it, but the series really does go into a lot of detail. I'm gonna give you my opinion, although I hope it doesn't taint yours in any way or influences yours in any way. I actually think that she's guilty of first-degree murder. By all accounts, including the accounts of his children, Dan was not abusive to Betty. Now, that doesn't mean that Dan wasn't a horrible person and even a malignant narcissist. There is evidence that he gaslighted her, but I think a lot of people who get into affairs deny the affair. So I wouldn't say that that itself is sufficient to successfully diagnose someone with NPD, but you can still have narcissistic traits without being a full-blown narcissist. Now, I'm not a psychologist. This is just from general knowledge because I am very interested in psychology. But I'm saying this because Dan may have actually denied the affair for years, and he may have been psychologically tormenting her by deducting money and tricking her into moving into a decrepit, broken down old home infested with rats while he lived in the family home with Linda and the children. I don't think it's far-fetched to think that he ostracized her deliberately and maybe even turned her children against her. And I don't think it's far-fetched to believe that Linda participated in this behavior. I'm not saying that Linda and Dan were saints. That's not the argument in this case. The question here is, did Betty go too far? Despite what Dan and Linda were allegedly doing to her, was it really enough to drive a reasonable and sane person to commit murder? She bought the revolver a month before the couple's wedding. She took that revolver with her to their house. If she truly wanted to kill herself, why didn't she do it anywhere else? Why did she go to their home very early in the morning when she knew they would be helpless and sleeping in bed? And she went there armed. If she really just wanted to talk, why did she go there with a fully loaded revolver? Why not go with an empty one if it was just for threatening purposes? And most importantly, this was not an automatic weapon. She had to manually pull the trigger for each of the 5 times that the weapon discharged. And then the most damning of all, in my opinion, is the location of where the bullet made contact with Dan and Linda. So again, to remind you, Linda was shot in the back of the head and the chest, and she died instantly right there. And Dan was shot in the chest. Betty has always boasted that she was a marksman ever since her youth, ever since school. So she was very good at aiming and very good at shooting. What are the odds that someone just reacted and screamed and, as she said, tensed on the trigger, only to land 3 shots, each at a fatal area, the head and the chest? In all honesty, if I were a member of the jury, I would have had no reasonable doubt that she was guilty of first-degree murder. And that's quite a big thing for me to say, because when I first came across her story and I watched her interview with Oprah, again, this was before I was even born, so I think this interview was after her incarceration in the early 90s. I felt for Betty. I felt so sorry for her. And I understood why women all over the country, and even men, sympathized with her and supported what she did. But then there comes a point where no matter how sorry you feel for someone, it's never nice to go through what Betty went through, being discarded like that after she gave her husband her youth and her beauty and the best years of her life, only to lose out to a younger version of herself. That's not a nice thing, but it's not enough to commit murder. Assuming her allegations against Dan and Linda were true and they were just tormenting her this entire time, there were other things that she could have done. She could have changed her phone number, she could have moved, she could have avoided any potential interaction with them and just moved on with her life. She even had a younger boyfriend herself when she murdered Dan and Linda. So I think she took it too far. I think the prosecution were spot on with saying that she just would not let it go. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the custody. That's what she said it was about. For me, it really comes across as a classic case of, how dare you use me and discard me only to replace me with a much younger woman. Being a lawyer himself, Dan actually recorded and took photos and just documented everything that Betty did. So the vandalizing of his property, the voicemails that she would leave him and Linda, everything she did, he documented as proof for use in the divorce proceedings, because of course he had no idea he was going to be murdered. In fact, people would warn him that she was talking about shooting him or talking about harming him and Linda, and he would always laugh it off and say that he was the golden goose. Like, she would never hurt me because I'm the source of all of her wealth, and she was, according to him, obsessed with money. Unfortunately for Dan, he was wrong, as we know. Again, I'm not absolving him because what he did was despicable, in my opinion. But as the prosecution said, this isn't about whether Dan and Linda were perfect people. This is about whether their death was justified by what they did. But it's up to you at the end of the day. Some people might actually think that Dan deserved this. And I'm not here to judge. That's not my place. That's not my job. I don't think anyone should judge. I mean, this is not an assumption. It's very clear that a lot of people do think that she did the right thing. So now you know what I think. I would have gone for first degree. What would you have gone for? Are you convinced that this was a premeditated act? Or do you buy Betty's story that she was driven to kill after years of abuse? Let me know what your verdict is in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, and I will catch you in a future video.